you to our conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely hope that this meeting today may provide you with plenty of room to discuss and to share knowledge and also to share insight so that this discussion today may be fruitful and be beneficial for all participants and audience so that we can contribute back at the end of the day.
Recording in progress.
But before we proceed to our main program today, firstly, it is my honor to express our sincere gratitude to the Rector Representative of Universitas Riau, Vice Rector 3, Professor Dr. Iwantono, MPhil, the Chair of Committee, Associate Professor Dr. Maria Maya Lestari, SH MSc MH, the Dean of the Law Faculty of Universitas Riau, Associate Professor Dr. Meksasa Indra, SH MH. And secondly, it is my honor to introduce our amazing and fantastic key speakers that will share their knowledge and expertise with us today. Excellency, the Dean of the Law Faculty of Universitas Riau, Associate Professor Dr. Edmond Makarim, SCOM, SHLLM. Excellency, Professor Stefan Koss, PhD from Bundeswehr Universität München. Excellency, Professor Dr. Rizal Rasman from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Excellency, Associate Professor Frank Don, PhD from National Cheng Kung University, Taiwan. Excellency, Professor Suri Moon, PhD from Graduate Institute, Geneva. Our agenda today will consist of first, opening ceremony, secondly, singing Indonesian National Anthem Indonesia Raya, thirdly, keynote speech, fourthly, plenary session, and lastly, closing ceremony. Into our next agenda, in which to deliver keynote speech, in which to sing Indonesian National Anthem Indonesia Raya, I would like to respectfully ask for all speakers and all participants to turn on your camera and stand up. Thank you. You may be seated. Into our next agenda, in which to deliver keynote speech and welcoming speech. Without further ado, it is my honor to welcome the committee chair Associate Professor Dr. Maria Maya, to deliver her welcoming speech. The screen is yours, Miss.
Okay, thank you, MC. My voice clear there?
Crystal clear, Miss.
Okay, thank you. The Honorable Mr. Vice Chancellor of the University of Riau, Professor Iwantono, with honors, our Dean, Faculty of Law, Bapak Dr. Meksasa Indra, and we are proud of our great speaker, and on the screen is already Professor Stefan Koss. Hello, Professor Stefan Koss. I say hello again. And next,
Hello, hello lagi.
okay. Thank you,
Ya,
Prof.
iya.
Yes, okay.
Saya
And
senang sekali di sini ya.
yeah, it's the second time you join to our conference, ya, Prof.
Sudah 3 atau mungkin 4 kali.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. And next here is we can see on the screen Professor Riza Rasman. Hello, Professor Riza Rasman. Assalamualaikum, Prof.
Assalamualaikum. Hello.
Sehat ya, Prof?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. In here, I would try to say hello, Professor Surimun. Hello, Suri. Hello. Or haven't joined yet? I think okay. We are going to the next speakers. Asok Professor Frank Don. Hello.
Hi.
Prof. Don. Okay. This is our first time we meet in Zoom. Okay. Thank you. And also we have on the screen this Professor, Associate Professor Edmond, Bapak Edmond Makarim. Assalamualaikum, Pak Edmond. Haven't joined yet. Okay, it's okay. And also, good day for all participants. Okay, this conference is second Riau annual meeting, Law and Social, has organized by Faculty of Law. And in this conference, we raise issue of how COVID-19 has changed all our life, our communication, our government policy, and also history and change the pattern of life of state and world. Today, we have lived from conventional lifestyle turned into the technology and I think healthy living. For this reason, this conference we raise the theme of the discussion is reconstruction of law in social in the new life. We hope that by holding this seminar, it will provide new view from various angles of knowledge, which will be presented by the all speaker in this afternoon. And the last, welcome to this seminar. Keep in health and obey the C19. Okay, this is my kata sambutan ya. I think I will return the script to MC. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mrs. Committee Chair, for that fine speech. Now it is my honor to welcome the Dean of the Law Faculty of Universitas Riau, Associate Professor Dr. Meksasa Indra, to deliver his welcoming speech. The screen is yours, sir.
Terima kasih MC. Izinkan dan perkenankan kami menyampaikan sambutan ini di dalam berbahasa Indonesia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bersyukur kita kepada Allah, Tuhan Yang Maha Esa, atas limpahan rahmat dan karunia-Nya yang sampai pada saat sekarang ini masih senantiasa melimpahkan banyak nikmat, ya, terutama nikmat sehat dalam situasi dan kondisi pandemi yang belum berakhir ini. bersalawat kita kepada Nabi dengan ucapan Allahumma shalli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. Mudah-mudahan di yaumil akhir nanti kita dapat syafaat dari beliau. Amin amin ya rabbal alamin. Yang sama-sama kami hormati Bapak Rektor Universitas Riau yang dalam hal ini diwakili oleh Bapak Wakil Rektor dan Kemahasiswaan dan Alumni Bapak Profesor Dr. Iwan Tono MP. Terima kasih Prof. Iwan atas perkenan waktunya untuk membuka event seremoni conference pada siang waktu Indonesia ini. Kemudian kami sapa para narasumber yang menjadi keynote speak pada conference kita hari ini. Pertama, Profesor Surimon, PhD dari Jenewa yang tadi belum bergabung bersama kita, mudah-mudahan nanti bisa menyusul. Kemudian Profesor Dr. Muhammad Rizal Rasman dari Malaysia. Terima kasih Prof atas waktunya. Ini udah kali kedua ya Prof Rizal?
Iya, kali kedua.
Mudah-mudahan sehat selalu Prof Rizal. Amin.
Insya Allah. Amin.
Kemudian Prof Stefan Koss dari Jerman. Halo Stefan.
Halo.
Ini udah kali keempat ya Prof Stefan.
Ya, sudah tahu baik.
Terima kasih
Fakultas
atas
kita.
waktunya Prof Stefan. Sehat-sehat selalu. Salam sama
Dengan
keluarga
senang
di
hati.
Jerman.
Iya.
Mudah-mudahan lain waktu bisa kita bertemu lagi setelah pandemi ini berakhir.
Ya,
Kemudian Mr. Frank Dons, PhD dari Taiwan. Mr. Kemarin saya dapat laporan dari Pak Dr. Hengki, konon kabarnya Mr. Frank mau datang ke Indonesia ya untuk mengunjungi salah satu situs sejarah yang ada di Riau. Mudah-mudahan nanti setelah pandemi kita dengan segala kerendahan hati, Mr. Frank untuk bisa menyambut kehadiran Mr. di Pakambaru ya untuk kita kunjungi tempat yang bersejarah itu.
Terima kasih.
Semoga Tuhan memperkenankan. Kemudian yang kami hormati Pak Dr. Edmund Makarim, SLLM, Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih Pak Kan atas waktunya. Tadi laporan dari Bu Maria juga belum join ya bersama kita. Mudah-mudahan nanti bisa. Kemudian Bapak Ibu peserta conference yang hadir ya atau yang join pada siang hari ini waktu Indonesia yang terdiri dari berbagai perguruan tinggi ya, yang ada di Indonesia. Bapak Ibu para narasumber yang saya hormati, Pak Rektor, tema conference kita pada kesempatan yang kedua ini yang dilaksanakan oleh Fakultas Hukum Universitas Riau, yakni hukum dan aspek sosial di masa pandemi. Ya, sebagaimana kita ketahui, aspek yang berhubungan dengan COVID itu tidak lagi menjadi persoalan satu bangsa, tapi sudah menjadi persoalan yang mengglobal. Hampir semua aspek atau sisi kehidupan kita berubah sebagai akibat dari pandemi COVID-19 ini. Aspek kultural, aspek interaksi sosial, kebijakan-kebijakan hukum, kemudian yang berhubungan dengan public policy, ya, kebijakan publik, kemudian bidang pendidikan, ya, cara anak-anak kita, cara para mahasiswa di perguruan tinggi dalam proses belajar mengajar, ya, yang sebelumnya itu berada di gedung-gedung, di ruang-ruang kelas, ya, sekarang terpisah melalui sarana yang bersifat virtual. Nah, sehingga Fakultas Hukum Universitas Riau menjadikan isu pandemi COVID-19 ini menjadi tema kita dalam kaitannya itu dengan aspek kebijakan hukum dan aspek sosial. Tentu harapan kita semua, doa kita bersama, mudah-mudahan pandemi COVID-19 ini bisa segera berakhir sehingga kita dapat kembali ke dalam situasi dan kondisi yang normal dalam melaksanakan segala aktivitas dan kegiatan kita sehari-hari. Perlu kami sampaikan atau perlu kami informasikan kepada para narasumber, Bapak Ibu peserta seminar pada siang hari ini bahwa acara conference ini dilaksanakan sudah yang kedua kalinya. Ya. Pada tahun lalu kita alhamdulillah juga sudah melaksanakan conference dan berbagai tulisan dari kawan-kawan dengan sipik hukum maupun sosial lainnya sudah dimuat ya melalui jurnal ya dalam rangka untuk menambah indeks kumulatif Bapak Ibu dosen dalam rangka untuk kepangkatan dan fungsional. Mewakili pimpinan fakultas, kami mengucapkan banyak terima kasih kepada para narasumber yang telah menyempatkan waktunya, meluangkan waktunya untuk berbagi ilmu pengetahuan ya, kepada Prof. Surimon, kemudian Prof. Rizal, ya, Prof. Stefan, Associate Frank, ya, kemudian Associate Profesor Edmond, ya, banyak terima kasih kami sampaikan atas waktu dan sudah diluangkan sehingga dapat join bersama kita semua dalam rangka untuk membahas ya isu-isu yang terkait dengan masalah hukum dan aspek-aspek sosial ya dalam situasi dan kondisi pandemi ini. Harapan kita semua mudah-mudahan kegiatan ini dapat berjalan lancar dari awal sampai akhir sehingga dapat menambah hasanah dan wawasan berpikir kita dalam rangka untuk pengembangan ilmu pengetahuan, khususnya ilmu hukum dan cabang-cabang ilmu sosial lainnya. Kami kira tidak banyak yang dapat kami sampaikan, ya cukup sekian saja mewakili pimpinan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Riau. Tapi sebelum ditutup, kami menyampaikan pantun ya, 2 buah pantun. Jadi Prof. Stefan, Prof. Frank, Prof. Rizal mungkin sudah familiar lah dengan pantun ya. Jadi Riau itu punya local wisdom, kearifan lokal. Di dalam setiap event seremian itu ada semacam pantun ya, bahasa-bahasa kiasan yang itu dimaksudkan dalam rangka untuk menghormati tamu, sindiran dan aspek-aspek lainnya. Ya, jadi saya bacakan 2 buah pantun. Pergi ke mall membeli burger. Burger dibeli untuk menyambut tamu. Terima kasih para narasumber atas kesediaannya berbagi ilmu. Melihat dunia dari atlas. Atlas diletak di kampus Gobah. Selamat mengikuti kegiatan Ramlas. Semoga keilmuan kita semakin bertambah. Jadi kalau Prof. Stefan dan Prof. Frank nanti kalau mau pesan, bisa dipesan ke Fakultas Hukum Universitas Riau. Dan itu tidak berbayar, Prof. Rizal. Kalau Prof. Rizal, Malaysia mungkin sudah biasa ya, Prof. Jadi kalau Prof. Frank dan Prof. Stefan bisa nanti dipesan ke Fakultas Hukum atau mudah-mudahan Asosiat Prof. Frank bisa ke Riau, nanti kita berbagi pantun, Prof. Frank.
Oke.
Saya kira sekian saja yang dapat kami sampaikan mewakili pimpinan fakultas ya. Akhir kalam saya tutup dan saya akhiri. Sekali lagi kami mengucapkan banyak terima kasih kepada semua pihak yang sudah berpartisipasi ya, kepada panitia Bu Dr. Maria dan kawan-kawan yang sudah mempersiapkan acara ini dengan baik, menghubungi para narasumber kita sehingga mereka berkesempatan untuk hadir pada siang hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mr. Dean, for that fine speech. Now, it is my honor to welcome the representative of the Rector of Universitas Riau, Professor Dr. Iwantono as Vice Rector 3, to deliver his keynote speech. The screen is yours, sir.
Baik, terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi rasulillahi ajma'in. Allahumma sholli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. Mohon maaf nih saya pakai bahasa Indonesia juga nih nampaknya. Prof. Frank Don dan Stefan Koss, apalagi Pak Muhammad Rizal Razman tadi mengerti sekali bahasa Indonesia, jadi ya sudah kita pakai bahasa Indonesia saja ya, mohon maaf. Sebelumnya saya mohon maaf karena Pak Rektor yang seyogianya hadir dan memberikan sambutan pada waktu yang bersamaan ada agenda yang lain yang juga tidak bisa ditinggalkan, jadi beliau menitip salam untuk kita semua. Kemudian kami sapa para narasumber yang hadir pada the second Riau Annual Meeting on Law and Social Sciences yang ditaja oleh Fakultas Hukum Universitas Riau, yaitu Profesor Surimun, thank you, Profesor Stefan Koss, Profesor Rizal Rasman, Profesor Frangdon, dan Dr. Edmond Makarim yang sudah hadir di tengah-tengah kita dalam the second Riau Annual Meeting on Law and Social Sciences. Kami berterima kasih atas kehadiran para narasumber, ya, keynote speakers pada event ini, dan seperti yang tadi disampaikan oleh Pak Dekan Fakultas Hukum bahwa tema yang diambil terkait dengan bagaimana efek dari COVID-19 terhadap tata kehidupan baru di aspek hukum dan sosial itu menjadi menarik untuk dibahas, karena bagaimanapun juga kondisi atau pandemi COVID-19 ini pasti berdampak dalam kehidupan kita keseharian. Jadi kalau aspek hukum dan sosial tentu saja yang membahasnya adalah para ahli hukum dan ahli social sciences. Saya background-nya fisika, science and engineering, jadi kita membahas dari sisi yang lain. Jadi kalau sisi sosial dan aspek hukum tentu saja ini juga perlu dibahas, dan kemudian kami nanti insya Allah akan mendapatkan manfaat dari bahasan pada annual meeting ini. Kemudian kami menganggap bahwa kegiatan akademik yang merupakan event yang sangat bermakna, bermanfaat, ya. Pertama dalam rangka untuk sharing informasi, sharing pengalaman riset, ya, pengembangan riset di bidang sosial dan bidang hukum ini. Kemudian juga untuk meningkatkan kerjasama antar institusi, antar universitas, ya. Apalagi kami di Indonesia hari ini sangat di-encourage untuk menjalin kolaborasi, international collaboration. Melalui program Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka, kami harus mengikuti pergaulan internasional, ya, dan menjalin komunikasi dan kerjasama yang erat dengan institusi dan universitas internasional agar kami punya pengalaman yang luas dalam mengembangkan bidang ilmu yang kami geluti dan kami ajarkan untuk mahasiswa kami. Jadi memang ini adalah sebuah program yang memang didorong oleh pemerintah pusat untuk dilaksanakan oleh setiap fakultas dan program studi. Terima kasih atas sambutan dari institusi, dari Taiwan, dari Jerman, dari Jenewa tadi, ya, Malaysia, yang menyambut uluran kerjasama kami, ya. Mudah-mudahan ini ke depan bisa kita kembangkan, ya, kita lanjutkan untuk meningkatkan kualitas pembelajaran di tempat kami. Kemudian ini juga setiap fakultas, setiap prodi juga kami terus encourage, ya, untuk melaksanakan kerjasama internasional ini, karena bagaimanapun juga bahwa hari ini itu antar negara itu hampir tidak ada batas lagi. Riset bisa kita lakukan bersama, berkolaborasi, kemudian publikasi internasional juga kita bisa lakukan bersama-sama. Kemudian juga barangkali keunikan suatu negara itu juga menjadi bisa kita sharing, ya, melalui kegiatan-kegiatan bersama ini. Jadi kami berterima kasih, ya, atas kerjasama yang sudah dijalin, dan kita berharap agar ke depan kerjasama itu akan lebih dikembangkan lagi untuk tadi seperti yang saya sampaikan, untuk meningkatkan kualitas pembelajaran di tempat kami. Dan tentu saja kita juga berharap bahwa event Riau Annual Meeting ini juga akan bisa berlanjut, ya, berlanjut dan mungkin dikembangkan dari sisi partisipannya, ya, pesertanya lebih banyak dari yang saat ini misalnya, ya, melibatkan banyak kampus lagi di beberapa negara tetangga, misalnya di Singapura, di Brunei, Filipina, dan lain sebagainya. Sehingga lebih banyak lagi karya-karya ilmiah yang bisa kita sharing, bisa kita bahas dalam pertemuan Rio Annual Meeting ini. Itu saya pikir yang ingin saya sampaikan. Sekali lagi terima kasih pada seluruh pihak yang sudah berkontribusi dalam penyelenggaraan the second Rio Annual Meeting on Law and Social Sciences ini. Mudah-mudahan kita mendapat manfaat yang banyak dari kegiatan ini, dan mudah-mudahan semua apa yang kita sudah rencanakan ini dimudahkan Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Dan itu saja yang saya ingin sampaikan. Mohon maaf kalau ada yang kurang. Saya tutup. Billahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
To our primary session, it is my honor and respectfully to ask to all of our speakers and participants to turn on their camera for photo session. I'm going to repeat. For all participants and audience, I'm respectfully asking all of you to turn on your camera for photo session. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to proceed to our main program, plenary session, who will be led by our amazing moderator, Dr. Deliana, SH, LLM. She's an outstanding lecturer. She took her first degree at Universitas Andalas in 1999. Then she continued her second degree at University Kebangsaan Malaysia in 2005. And after that, she took her third degree at Universitas Pajajaran in 2016, where she was also Vice Dean 2 Associate, and she was also the head of Law Department of the Law Faculty of Universitas Riau. Without a further ado, the stage is yours, Miss.
Thank you, Joy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and the Honorable Prof. Rizal, Mr. Frank Don, Dr. Edmond Makarim, and good morning, the Honorable Professor Surimun and Professor Stefan Koss. It is an honor for me to be the moderator in this session. We already have 5 speakers in this conference, and the first speaker is Professor Surimun. Allow me to read Health Center. She is Professor of Practice, Interdisciplinary Programs, and International Relations, Political Sciences. She received a BA in History from Yale and MPA in International Relations from Princeton and PhD in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Her current research projects focus on the international sharing of outbreak-prone pathogens and the related benefits and the new business models of pharmaceutical R&D. She also directs the Knowledge Network on Innovation and Access to Medicines, a project that aims to maximize the contribution of research and analysis to strengthening the pharmaceutical innovation system, a topic she has researched for over 20 years. She is currently the principal investigator on 3 research projects and the recipient of a PRIMA grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation. Her areas of expertise are global governance, global health, technological innovation, access and sustainable development, formal and informal rules, global health, human rights, development assistance, trade and investment, outbreaks of infectious disease and global health security, power and the political and commercial determinants of health. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Moon to deliver her presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we will have another 10 minutes for question and answer session. To Professor Moon, time is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and the kind introductions and welcomes from everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to my colleagues in Asia. Good morning to those in Europe and perhaps elsewhere. Really, it's my great pleasure and honor to be speaking at this conference on a subject that I think is very relevant for really everyone around the world today who is living through this pandemic. What I wanted to do was to say a few words about the potential role of international law, which in my view has proven to be insufficient and really too weak to help to govern the global response to this pandemic and to help to get it under control. And that what we have seen since the beginning of COVID is a much stronger rule of law of the jungle, as we say in non-technical terms, in terms of the behavior of all sorts of actors. What I'd like to do is to illustrate some of my key ideas through a closer look at the question of access to COVID-19 vaccines, and then to ask about what some of the future implications for the global system might be. I will try to limit my presentation to about 20 minutes. I'll start my timer here, and I really look forward to the opportunity to exchange and discuss with all of the colleagues here. So let me just give you a quick overview of the presentation. I'll first begin with a brief reminder of some of the global problems that have been exposed by COVID-19, talk a little bit about what I mean by rule of the jungle and what we've been seeing with COVID-19 vaccine access, look at what are some of the arguments and justifications for the need for more international law and stronger international law, take us back in history about 15 years to the role of Indonesia in particular in the creation of the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, and what that tells us about where we need to go today and the really critical role of leadership coming from the national level. So let me begin with just a few observations, and I think these will be familiar to many of you, but still just to set the stage here. When we think about the direct health impact of COVID-19, we have over 220 million cases, at least 4.5 million deaths, and we have the long impacts of people who have been suffering from COVID for many, many months, and this is likely to continue. We also have, of course, indirect health impacts, delayed or foregone care, the loss of health workers, the impacts on mental health that we don't even really understand yet. Looking beyond the health sector, of course, when we begin to look at the economic losses, again, we have a hard time even estimating the magnitude of the losses, but one of the most recent estimates put this at about almost $5 trillion in losses, 20 to 50% of GDP being spent in the high-income countries alone in terms of trying to rescue national economies, and an additional 120 million people pushed below the poverty line of about $1.90 per day. In terms of education, we know that school closures have been devastating for students and that they've affected directly 1.6 billion students. And we expect to see that this will have an impact over the lifetime of students in terms of lost earnings, a fall in work hours by laborers, countries that rely heavily on tourism having been very, very badly affected with a 74% drop over the last year. And of course, the pandemic has given rise to all sorts of human rights abuses, in particular for women and girls, for regular workers, migrants, and many other groups. So I think that it's safe to say that, at least from the perspective of Geneva, where we try to kind of look out at the world, this is really the greatest shared global crisis that we've seen since the Second World War. And one of the big questions this puts on the table is, what will be the response? Not just the direct response at national and global levels, but the response in terms of strengthening global systems and institutions, strengthening international law in the years to come. And this is really the question that diplomats here are wrestling with day after day. It's really the central topic of attention. So we have a number of problems at the global level that were exposed by COVID-19, and I've divided them here on this table into three categories: prevention and preparedness, detection and response, and cross-cutting issues. I won't go into these in great depth, but just wanted to sort of put these in front of you briefly. And I'll say that these problems have been identified through a series of global commissions, independent expert reports, a number of efforts that have been made to try to take a step back and analyze what's gone wrong. And if we look at prevention and preparedness, I think it's clear that no country was fully prepared. We didn't really know how to deal with upstream risks of zoonosis, of the jump of pathogens from animals to humans. When we think about detecting the emergence of pandemics and responding to them, we know that we had arrangements that really were not good enough for sharing information, pathogens and benefits across borders, for addressing trade and travel restrictions, for addressing access to vaccines and other countermeasures, for ensuring public trust, and ensuring that political leaders would actually do what they need to do to get a very difficult pandemic under control. Overall, we have, of course, also a set of cross-cutting issues that don't just have to do with preparedness or response, including compliance with international and national rules, financing at the international level, a World Health Organization that was not powered adequately to do what it needed to do, and a health sector that wasn't often working with others. So many problems. And a lot to address. I think on top of these somewhat technical problems that were addressed, I would like to also highlight what I call sort of the rule of the jungle. And I think what we saw, at least in the very early months of the pandemic in 2020, was an absolute breakdown in international cooperation, an absolute absence of any kind of rule of international law. One of the responses to this was an ambition to restore grand global efforts, an ambition to have a big global coordinated response. And one of these is the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, known as the ACT Accelerator, which is the biggest global effort to try to improve access to vaccines, diagnostics, medicines, etc. This was the ambition in, I would say, March or April of 2020. What we've seen over the last 18 months is, of course, reality setting in. And that reality has not met up to those grand ambitions. We have seen a mix of grand global efforts, but also quite a lot of fragmentation and an inability to actually meet those ambitions, an inability still to really address this pandemic at a global scale. I think coming into this is a very important development in international relations, which is, of course, the rise of the emerging powers, the middle-income countries. This is something that we've seen, of course, for decades now. But I think COVID-19 has really sharply emphasized the importance of this long-term global trend. So the rise of emerging powers, including Indonesia, and new constellations of actors at the global level, new groups of countries and other actors acting together in their own interests, rather than only big global efforts or a unipolar or bipolar world, as we say in the field of international relations. So I mentioned already a number of the different reviews that have been published over the last few months, since about May, and I'm not going to go into detail here. But a number of these reviews really conclude that we have to strengthen institutions at the global level. And as I was saying here in Geneva, it's really the season for reforms. The pandemic is, of course, not yet over, but it's very clear that if we don't begin working on those reforms now, we will lose the political window of opportunity that's very brief to actually make those reforms. Let me move now to my next point, which is regarding global vaccine access. And I think in many countries and in the international media, we have heard over and over again that we have a situation of huge inequity when we look at who has access to vaccines. This situation has been evolving. Happily, it has slowly been improving in many countries, in particular in the middle income countries. But the situation remains today in September 2021 that the high income countries have the greatest share of the world's vaccines on a per capita basis, on a proportional basis. They have more than they need. And the poorest countries in the world really don't have nearly enough. And in the poorest countries in the world, which you can see on the left side of the screen, we have vaccine coverage of only about 1% of the population, not even enough to vaccinate frontline health workers. But what this chart shows is really this picture in a nutshell. And it shows that as you get wealthier, and you have the wealthier countries on the right-hand side, you have more and more doses administered per 100 residents. And that's what you see, of course, on the y-axis. And you see a pretty clear gradient. And behind this is, of course, a very, very complicated story. But behind this is a story of countries using all of the resources at their disposal, whether that's money, whether that's technological capacity, whether that's diplomatic relationships, whether that's production capacity, industrial capacity. Countries using everything that they have at their disposal to get access to vaccines and competing with each other to do that. We've seen, unfortunately, too little international cooperation to ensure access to vaccines. And this, I think, explains largely the pattern that we see here today. So in a nutshell, law of the jungle. And so one of the big questions on the table is what can be done in any future pandemic to try to address this? Is it possible for international law to mitigate this situation? I think we'll never address it completely. At the end of the day, I believe national self-interest will be very, very powerful. But are there things that international law can do to try to mitigate this? And I think this leads us to the question for what do we need international law? Just as a reminder, we have in the global health sector, in fact, a very, very limited reliance on international law. And what you see in this table is a list of the types of normative instruments that are often used in global health. And at one end of the spectrum, here at the bottom of the screen, we have binding formal norms, by which I mean international treaties or conventions that are negotiated and binding upon governments. And we just have actually 2 or 3. It really depends on how you count. But we don't have much in health. And here we have, so this is on one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have normative claims, we have informal rules, and we have voluntary formal rules that are codified, but they're non-binding norms. They're backed by an intergovernmental entity, such as the World Health Organization. So what you see in this middle box, and you can see it's really the biggest box, is the many, many different types of norms and standards and frameworks and strategies and codes and principles and declarations and resolutions. These are the types of normative instruments that have been dominant in global health. And what we have seen is that there's been a reluctance by states and by the health community to actually try to negotiate more binding, hard international law. And of course, one of the consequences, I would argue, is that we have been unable at the international level to really deal with the crisis of the magnitude of this current pandemic. So one of the big challenges is to move people in their mindsets and in their political ambitions from one end of the spectrum and beyond this middle box where it's often easier to reach agreement among countries and negotiators. We need to move people from this middle box into the realm of binding formal norms. And this is where I think international law is very important. And scholars of international law can have an important role to play. Okay, let me move to my next slide here. So many of you will be familiar with the international health regulations, which are the one of the forms of binding international law that is in fact supposed to address the risk of outbreaks of infectious disease. It is, in a formal legal sense, binding on all 194 member states of the World Health Organization plus 2 additional states parties. It is one of the most universal international rules. It's a set of rules to which essentially all UN member states have agreed, but it's also been found to be dramatically lacking. So it's too weak. And it actually doesn't address a number of key issues. Not only is it too weak, but it has major substantive gaps. And so one of the conclusions of the International Health Regulations Review Committee and a number of other expert bodies is we have to strengthen the IHR. And indeed, many would agree that the IHR needs to be strengthened. And that's what I'm trying to show with this kind of egg yolk diagram that you see here. And I won't go into details in terms of what exactly this could look like, but just to say that in addition to substantive questions, we also, topic-specific questions, there are a number of cross-cutting issues that have to be addressed with compliance, with monitoring, with financing, and with organizational mandates for different international organizations. However, all of the analyses that we have been reviewing at the international level suggest that if we really want an adequate global system to prepare for and respond to outbreaks, we need a much more ambitious and comprehensive global system. And what I'm trying to show you here with this that we call a flower diagram is all of the different issues that actually do need to be better addressed in international law. One of these is countermeasure research and development and access. And by countermeasures, I mean here vaccines and drugs and diagnostics. I'll come back to that in a moment. Dealing with trade and travel restrictions, strengthening the development and humanitarian aid system, the international financial system, the links between health and the environmental sector, in particular, the need to address the risk of the animal-human transfer of pathogens, and last but not least, the issue of pathogen and benefit sharing. And this is where Indonesia has played a particularly influential role, is in pushing for international rules that make it more likely that countries will rapidly share samples of pathogens and the data, the genomic sequencing data that is linked to those pathogens, that countries will share that information openly and rapidly at the international level, but that in exchange, countries will receive benefits from that sharing. And among those benefits should, of course, be vaccines and other countermeasures. So let me come back to that in just a second. What I wanted to highlight here, excuse me, is that there's absolutely no agreement right now at the international level on what may ultimately be included in any kind of new international treaty or framework for pandemic preparedness and response. Whether we'll just address one of these flower petals, all of them, or in fact, none of them. And the ambition might be limited, in fact, back down to just the IHR. And so this is really one of the questions that's on the table. Of course, even if we could negotiate a much broader pandemic treaty, we would still have to deal with the cross-cutting issues that you see on the outside of the box: financing, organizational mandates, compliance and enforcement, monitoring, research, etc. The last question that I think is really on the table is, of course, how many countries would ultimately agree to any kind of international rules governing any of these issues. And what we've tried to show with those little boxes with the numbers inside them is that you might, in fact, have a huge range, that not every country is likely to agree in the same way that we have a universal agreement on the IHR. We're probably not going to get that kind of agreement on many of these other issues. You might have only 130 countries agreeing, or 60 countries, or 125 countries. It will really depend on the issue. So the magnitude of the challenge is really, I would say, quite enormous in terms of crafting an adequate international system of laws and rules to try to address the many, many risks posed by pandemics. And what I wanted to flag here is a new informational resource that our center has recently launched called governingpandemics.org, where we try to help to make sense of the magnitude of this challenge by providing updated information on a number of the different issues that have to be addressed, such as you see in that outer circle, and what relationship they may or may not have ultimately to what's being called a pandemic treaty. So in the interest of time, I won't go into this, but I encourage you, if you're interested in more information, to look there. So let me begin to wrap up my talk by going back in history and taking you back about 15 years. Many of you certainly in Southeast Asia will remember the H5N1 crisis, which of course spread rapidly around the world, particularly through the movement of migrating birds. And Southeast Asia was one of the regions that was the hardest hit by H5N1. There was a lot of fear at the time that H5N1 could become a global pandemic, and it had a very, very high mortality rate. Certainly compared to COVID-19, I think we're seeing death rates of sometimes up to 50% or more. And many of you will remember, or perhaps are even directly involved in some of these discussions, but just as a quick reminder, we had in 2007 Indonesia the highest number of H5N1 cases and fatalities, and announced that it would stop sharing virus samples internationally. And for the international community, this was really a wake-up call because it was a break with previously existing practice where countries had shared influenza samples quite freely with each other. And at the time, the health minister said the current unfair access to vaccines worsens global inequality between the rich and the poor, between the North and the South. And I think that is more dangerous than a pandemic. Of course, this is a very stark reminder of what has been happening over the last year. The government did resume sharing not long after this announcement, but the decision to withhold those samples, even for a short-term basis, did kick off at the international level the negotiations that lasted 4 years, but that ultimately led to the WHO Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, what we call the PIP framework. And what the PIP framework did was reaffirmed, let's say, the principle of sovereignty over biological resources, put virus and benefit sharing on equal footing, which it had not been prior to 2007, and created a financing mechanism for equitable access to benefits, such as vaccines. Essentially, it created a quid pro quo. We will give pathogen samples in exchange for vaccine access, but it will not be a quid pro quo on a bilateral basis, but rather on a multilateral basis. And this agreement has been called a milestone in global governance. And ever since it was agreed in 2011, it has been pointed to repeatedly as an example that has to be expanded beyond influenza, for example, to include new pathogens like the one causing COVID-19. However, this has not happened. It has been impossible politically to get momentum and agreement to actually build on this success. But I do think it's important to remember how the decision of one country can prompt the creation of international law in a way that is very, very useful ultimately for the well-being of all. I want to fast forward just about 3 years to 2010, when we had, of course, another influenza outbreak, which did become a global pandemic, and that was H1N1. And many of you will also remember H1N1. And back then, the Director General of WHO said, this time around, we've been aided by pure good luck. It did not mutate. We didn't have resistance to the drug. The vaccine proved to be a good match. Had any of these things gone wrong, we would be in a very different situation today. Indeed, we dodged a bullet in 2010, which we did not dodge in 2020. She warned that had the virus turned more lethal, and remember H1N1 was much less dangerous to human health than COVID-19, we would be under scrutiny for having failed to protect large numbers of people. Vaccine supplies would have been too little, too late, with large parts of the developing world left almost entirely unprotected. And I don't think I need to remind us of how relevant her warning is today. So to come to my conclusions, as I come to the end of my time, I think it's very clear that we have many weaknesses in the global system that need to be addressed, that international law has been underutilized in global health as a counterweight to the law of the jungle, by which I mean really survival of the fittest. We have today a political opportunity to craft new agreements, seeing that this is indeed the biggest crisis in 70, 80, 90 years, depending on how you count. But in order to get those agreements, because of the political difficulty of getting that agreement, we really do need courageous leadership and persistence. And I really want to commend the government of Indonesia for the actions that it took in 2007, which I think did prompt a political process that ultimately benefited all countries. If you're interested in following some of these debates and developments further, I would encourage you indeed to consult our new resource. So with that, I thank you, terima kasih, and I look forward to any questions or remarks you may have.
Giving two options, that firstly to revise the international health regulation itself, or to establish a treaty state base. And one concern that there is an ambiguity in myself, Prof. Moon, that do you think, I want to ask your point of view, is that the wording in the international health regulation that you tried to be revised? Because we know that several wording in international health regulation is using a shall as imperative word. We know that it's also there are some multi-interpret in International Court of Justice also regarding the shall. Do you think that also regarding the distinction between hard and soft law, do you think that the wording shall under International Health Regulation 2005 should be revised? What in a good way? I need your point of view. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you.
To Professor Moon, please, you may answer.
Great, thank you for that really excellent question. I think indeed this has been one of the big issues on the agenda is how much legal weight and impact really does the IHR have. And some of my colleagues argue that it was essentially ignored, that on paper it's a shall, on paper it is binding, and legally governments have committed to respecting the IHR, but we've seen the reality over the last year and a half, and certainly that's not been the case. I think when we think about the distinction between hard and soft law, it's important to not only look at the wording of the agreement itself, but also other aspects of the legal and organizational arrangements. So is there third-party monitoring, for example? Is there the ability of WHO to independently assess whether a country has complied or not with its commitments? Is there enough of a financial commitment, in fact, to implement a number of the measures? Is there a regular sort of conference of the parties where countries come together and really build up, I think, some of the political buy-in? And we've seen this with other types of treaties. For example, the Framework Convention on Tobacco control has much stronger arrangements. And in some ways, by the way, the PIP framework, which I mentioned, it's not a treaty. The PIP framework is a very strange instrument in that it is passed through a non-binding WHA, World Health Assembly resolution, but it is binding because it's binding in the sense, it's hard law in the sense that it is enforced through contracts, through bilateral contracts between WHO and a number of pharmaceutical companies and with governments. And you have a very strong financial arrangement that allows the PIP framework to be credible, that actually says that PIP can deliver on vaccines in the event of an influenza pandemic. And so I think that the distinction between hard and soft law needs to incorporate many other elements besides the wording. But I think, in fairness, what we can say is that the IHR was demonstrated to be quite soft, ultimately, despite its formally binding nature. And this is what I think many governments, there's not that much disagreement that the IHR is currently conceived, as currently agreed, are insufficient. Where there is a lot of disagreement right now is what is politically feasible in terms of revising the IHR. And one of the most sensitive issues, as you're probably aware, is the question of whether we should empower an intergovernmental organization like WHO to do independent inspections of countries if countries are suspected of not fully cooperating with the international community. And on that, we really don't have any agreement right now.
Thank you,
Professor Moon, for the delightful answer. I'm afraid we don't have much time since Professor Moon has another agenda. She wishes to leave this conference earlier. Thank you very much again to Professor Moon. Hope we will meet again in another events, whether online or offline. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. Really, it's been a great honor, and I look forward to reading the conference proceedings. I'm sure I'm missing out on very, very interesting presentations, and I apologize for that, but I really thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay.
Now we are going to have another speaker. The second speaker is Professor Dr. Juris Stefan Koss. I will read a brief CV of Professor Koss. His educational background is law studies at the Bayerische Julius Maximilians Universitat Würzburg, Germany. First state law examination in Würzburg, second state law examination in Munich, doctorate in law at the Faculty of the University of Constance, and postdoctoral qualification at the University of Constance in 2002, and Vienna Legendi in civil law, corporation law, competition law, and international private law. His professional occupation since 2016, visiting professor at the Business Law Department of BINUS University Jakarta. Since 2017, visiting professor at the Law Faculty of Universitas Airlangga, Surabaya. And since 2011, visiting professor at the Law Faculty of Universitas Islam Riau, Pakambaru. And since 2019, visiting professor at Universitas Muslim Indonesia in Makassar. Professor Koss will have for about 20 minutes to deliver his presentation. To Professor Koss, time is yours.
Yeah, hello, thank you. To be honest, I could apologize for that. I don't have a topic which is exactly fitting to the COVID. There is two reasons. One reason is I'm full of COVID-19, and I made so many conferences about the impact of COVID-19 to the business law and so on and so on. So that I really would not be happy to do that again. But the other thing is, it's not a big problem, because actually COVID-19 is already so much endemic in our life and in the business, so that actually anything is impacted by COVID-19, especially everything which has to do with corporate social responsibility, which is my topic for today. I would like to introduce you a new legislation in Germany on due diligence in supply chains from this year. And I don't like this boring overview presentation, so I hope I will have the time to conclude my presentation with a little bit discussion on the purpose of these national legislations and how it is in the context of international law and of the, let's say, courtesy of the states. Now, we all know the problem in the industrial countries. We have very powerful companies and concerns which are producing in third world countries or in underdeveloped, least developed countries. And this is one recent topic here, that an NGO is suing German companies for producing in China under the use of forced workers of the Uyghur minority. And this is just one example of many of these topics we had here in Germany in the last years. And we have already a long discussion on how to make sure that the human rights are better enforced in this surrounding. Now, we have several national supply chain due diligence acts already internationally. In France, we have the Loi de Vigilance. As I know, there is no sanction if you infringe that. We have limited to children work, the Wetsorgplicht Kinderarbeit in Netherlands, and the Modern Slavery Act in UK, and another one in Australia, which all have, as I know, not the kind of sanctions which would be wishable to enforce the law and the human rights in this international surrounding in the supply chains. Which means in the whole supply chains from the production to the end product. The German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz is a horrible word due to the German language custom to add one word to another. So Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act from 21, let's call it SCDA. Is applying to, in the first step, to enterprises with at least 3,000 employees, which is affecting in a moment around 600 German enterprises. Later it will be 1,000 employees, the limit, and then it will be already 2,900 enterprises in Germany, which have administrative headquarters or registered office in Germany, or have a branch office in the Federal Republic of Germany. Smaller supply chain companies will also be affected abroad because the companies who are addressed by the law will be forced to make contracts with their supply partners and will enforce the rules of this legal act to their contractual situation. So it is most likely that it will also affect the smaller companies abroad and in Germany. Now this legislation is orientating to the guiding principles on business and human rights. As per here, the Ruggie principles, states have a duty to protect human rights. Companies have a responsibility to respect human rights and to comply with all applicable laws. And those affected by human rights violations must be granted appropriate and effective access to remedial options. Now the scope is quite wide, different than the Dutch Act, for example. It applies to the whole supply chain from the raw material production to the end product. It applies to human rights, I will come back to that, and certain environmental standards, as long as they related to the human rights, which is not totally complying with the international rules, which, as I know, widen it to more environmental standards. The SCDDA does not export German social standards. That was a big discussion. Do we export our high German social standards in labor, for example, to the international level? We do not export that, for example, to Bangladesh or to Indonesia. It's only about essential, internationally acknowledged human rights, which are meant here, which are anyway accepted internationally in international contracts by also the countries of the third world. And nevertheless, there will be quite a problem, because as you know, maybe not all the rules of the international law on the human rights are totally accepted by all countries. We have for example, to the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979, we have certain different interpretations and certain waivers of mostly Muslim countries, but also, for example, Singapore, because of assumed contradiction to the interpretation of the Quran and of the Islam. Singapore does it in respect to their agreement of the minorities they have, so they didn't want to disturb this order of the minorities, also did not disturb the Muslim society there. So these rules of anti-discrimination indeed are in this legislation, and that will lead maybe to a problem if countries produce in other country, or companies produce in countries where we have a systemic discrimination of female or of let's say diverse people. Now, the interesting aspect here is the legal technique, the legal fixation of the corporate social responsibility obligations. As I know, it's a very big interest in Indonesia. I know a lot of colleagues who work on corporate social responsibility, and I always had the discussion on the corporate social responsibility, because many countries have these corporate social responsibility rules without enforcing it, making it not obligatory, making it as a wish to the countries. Yeah, so write it in an act, but if they don't comply, then nothing happens. Now, we have here an interesting approach, which is also the approach, for example, of the data protection law in Europe. If you have complex organizations where you cannot say who is really immediately responsible for certain situation, then it's better to set organizational duties. We call it in German Organhaftung, and we call it in German also the Organisationshaftung. Organizational litigation, organizational obligations comply with the risk management, risk analysis. So give them the duty to make a clear, documented risk analysis and risk management, give them the duty to make preventive and remedial measures depending on the distance from the infringement of the human right. For example, if the human right infringement is in the production of the raw material, then of course in the end product in Germany, maybe there is not a control which is directly to the production, but there can be at least the duty to make preventive and remedial measurements, for example, by contracting, establishing of a complaint mechanism, and that is important, not only complaint mechanism by the people who are in fact who are infringed by human rights infringements, but also by anybody. So the famous whistleblower problematic, and also annual documentation on and reporting obligations to the competent authority. This law is not setting an obligation of result. So there is not a guarantee that there is no infringement of the human right, for example, in Bangladesh, but the companies must make this effort. So there is the obligation to make effort, which is quite reasonable in my opinion. Some important aspects on that. First of all, we see the duty to organize a corporate whistleblower procedure. This is quite actual, quite recent topic here. The whistleblower procedure, whistleblower was always a little bit negative. Yeah, so a traitor in the company. Now there is a duty of the companies to protect and to support whistleblowing. So anybody who is working in the company or in the supply chain can denounce problems of infringements in the human rights in any part of the supply chain. So if a textile seller or a wholesale company is producing that in the third world country and the producing situation is bad, and someone of the company knows that, then he can whistleblow. And of course, there will be no labor no labor aspects which are negative for him. So no punishment, nothing at all. Then another point is that the termination of existing business relations is only ultima ratio. There is no, normal regularity, there's no duty to terminate totally the business connection. Only if there is no other remedy, it cannot be fulfilled by another mean than stop the cooperation, then it would be the termination. Affected persons can authorize German unions or German NGOs to take civil law legal actions. This sounds good. We call that besondere Prozessstandschaft in the procedure, in the legal procedure. This sounds basically good. However, it will not play a big role in the moment because mostly the German civil law is not applicable. So the NGOs and the unions will not have a big opportunity to do something here. So the result in the moment is no civil liability. There is no civil liability at the moment, only fines up to 800,000 euro if a company fails to initiate remedial measures in breach of its duty or does not implement a remedial concept vis-a-vis a direct supplier. Fine up to 2% of the average annual turnover if the company has an average annual turnover of more than 400 million euro. And companies can be excluded from public tenders for up to 3 years. This is in the moment the sanctions of the law if there is no compliance with the law. So as I mentioned already, and this is for me the most crucial point, there is no special civil liability claim by affected person. So someone who is affected by human rights infringement, for example, in a company in India or in Bangladesh, cannot go with a special civil liability to a German court and claim for damage. There is the opportunity to make a civil liability and claim for damage repair in the general German tort law. However, that will not play a big role. As I mentioned already, the conflict of law rules, which is in Europe the Rome II regulation, will mostly lead to application of the law where the damage arises. And that is not Germany. That will be the third world country where this infringement is arising. By the way, it's of course not only third world countries. It could also be an industrial country where we have this infringement. But nevertheless, the German law will mostly not be applicable. And important is also that was a big discussion in the making of the law that the SCDDA is not an overriding mandatory provision of the domestic law in the Article 16. That was a proposition because if that was an overriding mandatory provision, then even if the law of the third world country or the third country is applicable, then this rule of the German law had to be applied. It's working a little bit like the ordre public. Not same, but a little bit like that. And important also, the burden of proof is with the injured party, which makes it difficult for a worker in a company somewhere to make a claim for damage or repair. Now, this will change in the future. We have now the plan of a European legislation, which will be the Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive. This year, the European Commission is awaited to propose a proposal for that. And most likely, this legislation will be much more strict than the German legislation we have at the moment. And it is awaited very fast. We will definitely have a special civil litigation. And we will, I'm quite sure of that, have the applicability of at least these rules in the national frame. So in the European Union, and of course then in the member states. And we await also the burden of proof to the company. So the affected person in the company in the fabric which is infringed does not have the burden of proof anymore. In that situation, the claim opportunity for unions and NGOs will make sense. And we will have a much more strict rule, which, in my opinion, will help to enforce the human rights in the international level. Now, I come to the to make it not too long, so I will stick to the 20 minutes, which is always a little bit of a problem. I come to the interesting aspect, which is always interesting me because I'm interested in extraterritorial effects of legislations. And I found when I make the research for that paper, a discussion and an article, journal article by an African guest lecturer from a German university. I think she's from Kenya. And she is claiming that national compliance laws, which we have here on international supply chains, are not fair towards developing countries. Why not fair? It's about human rights, and human rights should be in the interest of anybody, right? But in fact, this is not the case. The case is that we could long discuss, for example, I did that in Bandung in 2017, and there was a long discussion about, is this human rights enforcement in the sense of the Western view, is this fair, or shouldn't we accept infringement of human rights in the light of the cultural identity of countries? Now, this is indeed an issue, and I think this is what this article writer refers to. She says that these national regulations have an unilateral character and force African people to comply with human rights and to care for the human rights of people who are not the business of the states who make these acts. So like Germany should not care for the human rights in these countries, and this is unilateral. Better would be international agreement on that, and then enforce the international agreement. And the extraterritorial impact of these national regulations on business ethics would be an infringement of the international public law. And an American researcher in 2008 wrote even, I citate, that it is an illegitimate, if not imperialistic, exercise of unilateral jurisdiction unless they are conceptualized in the light of the democratic inclusion, whatever that democratic inclusion means. Now, what is my point of view on that? And that is, I think, a discussion point for the surrounding Indonesia. So I'm sure there would be also contradiction to that. In my opinion, national compliance laws are a legitimate regulation interest of the state. I put that in the context with my general point of view that in the nowadays we have a certain right to be, let's say, egoistic. Yeah. So if we see the presentation of the first speaker, this egoism, of course, is not nice. But for example, if we look to the ubiquity of the technology world, of the digitalization, then the national states have rather no possibility to regulate or to limit, for example, infringement of the data protection of their citizens. Now, what is the result? That powerful states will apply their law extraterritorial, like the general data protection regulation of the European Union. Now, is this fair? No, it is not fair. Is it extraterritorial? It is extraterritorial. But this is a question of self-defense of the states if we don't have the power anymore. Now, if we see that the human rights enforcement in certain countries was obviously not very sufficiently in the light of the international public law and in the light of the international contracts, then I would say we need maybe other instruments to enforce that. Now, is it really a question of diversion between the division between the international states and the third world countries? In my opinion, not, because these countries signed the contracts of human rights protection. So that is a global value. We have a global value. Now, if we talk about, of course, about the anti-discrimination aspects, Now, this can be said, maybe is not a global value, but can we really force for example, the German society to buy products which are not produced in the way they would like to have it in their ethic? This is the question. So introduction of national human rights related compliant rules is a part of states' interest related to own markets, and thus an area of their own economic policy, the regulation of which has always a certain extraterritorial effect. If we see the antitrust law, it was always extraterritorial. Why? We have the right to regulate the business ethic in our territories. We have the right to regulate the markets in our territories. And so this is also a question of the protection of the consumers and of the markets, because can we really force the consumers to buy products which are produced in an unethical way? Not in unsocial way in the sense, in the point of view of the German society, but in an unethical way in the sense of the international human rights. Can I, as a consumer to be forced like that? And if we say no, we don't want that regulation, then the next step would be, okay, then we should also not give transparency to the consumer how it is produced, right? So is it misleading information if we don't say, be careful, don't buy that product because they produce it with Uyghurs? So is the transparency then maybe also an infringement which affects the interest of the third world countries which want maybe to produce in their way? So in my opinion, the constitutional situation of Germany is that we must in any way protect the human dignity, and the human dignity is an overwhelming aspect which cannot be changed by the legislator, and so the German state is obliged to take care of that in the interest of their own consumers, in the interest of the own market. And finally, we also see inequivalence of the markets if we allow certain countries to produce in a not compliant, human rights compliant way, which makes the production cheaper, and others comply, which is not the same conditions for the market, and that belongs to the very own market of the states. So if I come to the conclusion, in my opinion, this idea of we should not put our noses in the interest of the developing countries, how they do it, and we should stick to our own human rights, and this is not the way to regulate it, and extraterritorial thing is not okay here. In my opinion, that is absolutely not an argument in the light of the international business law and international business law, and we see it in many aspects that we have this extraterritorial aspect is not evitable, and as this is not only about some social standards, it's about international accepted human rights. I think the whole world, which is part of this system of human rights protection, should be able to accept that. So with that, I hope I was not too long. I think it's 3 minutes longer. I think we have enough for 5 minutes, maybe for Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention. If it was too fast, you can read that in my paper, which is published in the proceedings. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Professor, for the amazing presentation. We are going to have question and answer session for about 5 minutes. Should you have any question, please use raise hand icon. Yeah. Mention your name and your affiliation. Ada nggak? Nggak kelihatan. Iya. Belum. Huh? Enggak, dia minta tadi 5 menit. Q&A. Oh. Ya, saya Okay, Professor Koss, it seems
Okay.
Hello.
Please, yeah.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Please.
Yes, sir.
Pak Rahmat.
Shafriato from University of Riau.
Oh, yes, please. Sir.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Mr. Stefan.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello. I'm
okay,
from
Pak
University of
Shafriato,
Riau.
please address
Social
your...
and
Okay, please.
sorry, pardon?
We can hear you. I can hear you.
Yes,
Prof.
yes,
Thank you,
please.
sir. My name is Safri Harto from University of Riau. About this, as you have a book from your presentation. Forgive for me.
Sorry, excuse me. What can I do?
Okay, sorry. This is your presentation very good for me. But
Yeah,
you have books about this your presentation.
No, but I wrote a paper on that. It will be. I would be glad to transfer the paper to you if you contact me by WhatsApp.
Okay.
The preprint.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Mr.
You're
Stefan.
welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Bye. Thank you, moderator.
I think the committee will send the presentation to the paper to Pak Safri Harto. Ya, udah. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, I will have to leave now for the first because I must bring my daughter now to the kindergarten. I'm totally alone here. So I will stay tuned here, but in that case, I will come with another device inside at 16. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
His information, Muhammad Rizal Rasman is a professor of environmental law and management in the Institute of Environment and Development Lestari, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He's specialized in environmental law and management. His current research interests are governance for sustainability towards environmental justice, environmental sustainability based on law and management approaches, as well as environmental sustainability in health and technology-related studies. He obtained his Bachelor of Laws in 1995 from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Meanwhile, he received his Master of Law in 1997 from University of Wales, United Kingdom. He was conferred a Doctor of Philosophy from University Kebangsaan Malaysia in 2009. He also has been registered since 1998 as a professional advocate and solicitor of the High Court by the Kuala Lumpur High Court. Currently, he is the chairman of the Research Center for Sustainability, Science and Governments, Institute for Environment and Development, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He also serves on the editorial board of Malaysian Journal of Environmental Management, incorporating the Asia Pacific region, Malaysian Consumer Law Journal, and Asian Journal of Environment, History and Heritage. He also served on the executive committees of the International Conference and such as International Conference on Human Habitat and Environmental Change, International Conference on Consumer Law and Consumerism, Regional Seminar on Environmental Management, and many technical committees. Without further ado, we invite Professor Rizal to deliver his presentation. To Professor Rizal, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for kind introduction. And I would like to thank for the organizing committee for inviting me today. It's an honor for me to be here. For today, I will discuss on institutionalization of a new normal by the authorities during pandemic COVID-19 event. Since the title start with institutionalization, allow me to introduce introduction arrangement. Basically, institutional arrangement is a system of established and prevalent social rules that structure social interactions. It can be a formal form or informal form, with legal instrument or without legal instrument, to mobilize interaction between three main domains of institution. So meaning that institutional arrangement establish a system to establish interaction in the institution. So what are those three main domains of institution? Basically, there are three domains, namely society, government, and industry. As for society, having a subdomain of a smaller unit known as a family. Another subdomain is community, whereby a few smaller unit of family combined and establish a community of subdomain of society. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the government, starting from the grassroots, from the local government, or some nation called a municipal government, and further up, intermediate, a government known as a state government or provincial government, or it can be divisional government. And the highest subdomain of the government is the federal, central, or national, based on the terminology that been given in the constitution of the particular nation. Meanwhile, for the industry domain, compasses of subdomain of multinational corporation, government-linked corporation, as well as small, medium enterprises. So, this subdomain and this domain of the institution interact with each other very dynamically. It can be interaction between subdomain of society and a subdomain of the government, as well as the main domain of industry, whereby it's very dynamic interaction based on institutional arrangement. But nevertheless, since late 2019, early to 2020, the institution been interrupted by what? By COVID-19. And based on this slide, we can see COVID-19 has caused interruption throughout the world globally, because COVID-19 is the infectious disease caused by coronavirus. The virus named as having a crown. So it's very prestigious disease, whereby it been declared by WHO as a pandemic affecting many countries globally. Since it's infectious disease, it can spread around people. People can catch COVID-19 from others who has the virus. The disease spread primarily from one person to another through a small droplet from the nose or mouth, which expel with a person with COVID-19 cough, sneezes, or speaks. These droplets are relatively heavy, do not travel far, quickly sink to the ground. People can catch COVID-19 if they breathe in this droplet from a person infected with the virus. It's why it is to stay at least 2 meters away from others. These droplets can land on object or surface around the person, such as tables, doorknobs, handrails. And people can become infected by touching these objects or surface, then touching the eye or nose and mouth. This is why it is important to wash hands frequently with soap and water, or clean with alcohol-based hand rub. Since COVID-19 is infectious, we've been introduced a new normal, whereby we've been emphasized on practices 3 Ws and avoid 3 Cs. wash hands frequently with water and soap or sanitizer. And we need to wear face masks when we go out. And we need to watch the distance between other individuals more than 6 feet or 2 meters away. And we need to avoid these 3 C's. C first, the first C is close contact conversations. The second one, crowded places. And the third one, confined spaces. So eventually, what we have here, today, the intellectual discourse is a new normal, whereby all this while we're having seminars and conferences, very close contact conversation, is crowded and confined, but this time around is through webinar. So this is a new normal caused by the COVID-19. And more serious, whereby the COVID-19 new variants has emerged, whereby the variants of concerns, there are 4 that have been labeled by WHO, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. The earliest detected Alpha in the United Kingdom, Beta from South Africa, Gamma from Brazil, and Delta from India. The most spread throughout the world for Delta is also has been concern in Malaysia. Not only that, there's a variant of interest. Last year, WHO have labeled Eta, Iota, Kappa, and deadly Lambda from Peru. So it keeps worrying us. And based on data on 7 September 2021, about more than almost 222 million coronavirus cases and cost life more than 4.5 million deaths. And total cases worldwide, based on the linear data graph, is uprising. And if I share with you on the Southeast Asia ASEAN statistic, whereby 4 nations of ASEAN having total cases has been increased. For instance, Thailand now based on 9 September up to 1.3 million total cases. As for Malaysia, 1.9, Philippines 2.1, the Indonesia is uprising up to 4.1 million total cases. So based on the data that I've shared with you guys, the world data of COVID-19 and this ASEAN statistics, they are very worried data and really affected institutions. In this context, we need to apply institutional approaches. So basically, there are 4 approaches to look into the issue of spreading through of COVID-19. There are power approach, interest approach, knowledge approach, and forum approach. So have a look at the first one, power approach. Power approach is based on the core business of sources of power, meaning that in order to use this approach, we need to have a look. The individual nation have the power to mobilize to taking care of this particular issue. So the source of power is come from of a nation. Firstly, looking at the constitutions, the relevant legislations, as well as subsidiary legislations such as rules, regulation, and order that support the legislation for giving the power to deal with the matter. National, provincial, and municipal governments with existing legislations and management plans will benefit greatly using the legislations, the existing one, and the plans to respond to pandemic 19. For example, if I share with a Malaysian experience, whereby basically Malaysia have a legislation known as Prevention and Control Infectious Disease Act 1988. Basically, in terms of infectious diseases, Malaysia have a framework, a legal framework in dealing with infectious diseases, but not COVID-19. So, since COVID-19 is a pandemic globally, so Malaysia in 2020, Malaysia had passed two subsidiary legislations known Prevention Control Infectious Diseases, Declaration of Infected Local Areas Order 2020, and Prevention and Control Infectious Diseases, Measures Within Affected Local Area Regulation 2020, which imposed on the control movement of the people through several measures. For instance, if let's say one particular area has been affected, majority of the people has been affected by the COVID-19, so the government will announce that particular area will be known as EMCO. EMCO stands for Enhanced Movement Control Order, meaning that whoever stayed in the particular area that be declared as Enhanced Movement Control Order, they cannot move. They need to stay put, whereby the government will monitor the situation of the spreading through of the COVID-19. And those people outside from the particular area cannot go into the area. So meaning that the area has been controlled by the authorities to ensure as also to monitor the infectious disease of COVID-19. And that particular order will be remain within 14 days. If after 14 days, the area is not settled, so the government, the authority will extend it another 14 days. But if it's settled, the government will uplift that particular order, so the people can be a normal situation. All right. For municipalities or countries who do not have existing strategic plan or legislation, when they are developed, they should introduce contingency planning for pandemic situation. And this content can be informed by ongoing local COVID management challenges. For instance, I would like to share the Malaysian experience, whereby recently Malaysia has passed a plan known as National Recovery Plan, whereby to move from pandemic to endemic based on these three main indicators. The first one, daily cases. The second one, intensive care unit usage of the COVID-19 patient. And thirdly is a vaccinated adult population administered by the COVID. So based on these three indicators, the plan is covered based on the three dimensions of public health environment, on economic and social. It's based on sustainable development concept. So by this plan, basically, Malaysia has put four set of phases. For instance, phase one, whereby being categorized if the ICU usage of the COVID patients is limited. And phase two, whereby the ICU usage has become moderate. Third, adequate. And finally, phase four, meaning that that particular area has been sufficient ICU usage for the COVID patient. So in a way, this plan can be imposed when there is no certain answer by using the existing law. Okay, in terms of COVID-19, we are not looking solely on the infectious disease spread to the people, but also we need to, the COVID-19 also cause other problems. Okay, for instance, hospital healthcare facilities, quality sites, and individuals are producing more waste than usual, including face masks, glove counts, and other personal protective equipment, PPE, that could affect it with the COVID-19. This is also a large increase in the amount of single-use plastic being produced. So COVID-19 has affected not only affected people of spreading through the infectious diseases, but COVID-19 has affected plastic production, eventually become waste problem to the environment. So additional regulation and guidelines are needed for waste generated during COVID-19, especially due to increasing origination of potential contaminated waste. The second approach, known as ITES approach, founded or based on the cost and benefit principle, incorporated with three main dimensions: social dimension, economic dimension, and environmental dimension. As for social dimension, in terms of COVID-19, two main components are very essential in terms of social dimension. The first one, to increase the awareness level of the public, meaning that all the three main domains of the institution need to be to ensure the awareness will uplift as through the communication medium. So awareness rising and communication for healthcare staff and public is also required during COVID-19. And public communications for developing the additional guidelines, handling treatment and disposal waste generated during treatment, diagnosis, quarantine of the COVID-19 patient, and also a development of media such as website, public service announcement for hygiene practice and self-handling on waste management during COVID-19. That's for social dimension. As for economic dimension, the problem is that the lack proper waste management practices due to technical operations, financial constraint, particularly variable during the pandemic COVID-19. Also due low investment in core infrastructure, eventually led on the modern technology to treat a mixed contaminated waste during COVID-19. So COVID-19 should be warning that more basic infrastructure capacity in line with requirement relevant multi-environmental agreements is urgently needed. For instance, like Basel Convention on controlling transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal, Rotterdam Convention on shared responsibility, and Stockholm Convention on protecting human health and the environment for POPs. As for environmental dimension, sustainability assessment technology methodology will help decision makers to choose the best available technology for source segregation and primary disposal, and for destruction of the waste or recovery of material during COVID-19. This way, best environmental practices can be used and shared at the national level during COVID-19. Future impact for similar challenges can be managed in environmentally sound manner to sustainable development in order to achieve sustainable development goals. So sustainable development goal encompasses of 7 goals based on the concept of sustainable development. All right. Next, the third approach is knowledge approach. Knowledge approach is derived from the concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development initially introduced by the Brunner Report in 1987, and to understand sustainable development, sustainable science come to the picture. And for education is concerned, education for sustainable development, ESD, whereby encourage change towards sustainable development. Okay, I will short my discussion here. Okay, and for sustainable development has been embedded in international conference UNCED 92, MDG, and SDG. All right. For knowledge approach, in absence of appropriate technology, COVID-19 adopted a 3S methodology. The 3S methodology, meaning that the sorting, segregation, and storage is separated for the medical waste volume for point generations. And this methodology able to fulfill to solve a problem on the problem of waste of COVID-19, and as well as fulfill the SDG 3, 6, and 14 of SDGs. All right. All right. Finally, follow-up approach based on dynamic interactions, based on the 3 main domain, dynamically interacted for COVID-19, whereby basically it's a very crucial that three main domain of institution join together effort, have a forum approach in order to solve this kind of problem. Finally, I conclude that the institution based on these three main domain, society, government, and industry, by using the approach able to sustain the new normal of the COVID-19 pandemic event. With that, thank you very much.
All the speakers delivered their presentation. Now we have Mr. Frank Donan as a fourth speaker. Allow me to read his brief bio. Frank Donan is an associate professor in the Department of History of National Cheng Kung University, Taiwan. He specializes in Southeast Asian history and particularly in insular Southeast Asia. His research focuses on the struggle of the Indonesians against Dutch colonialism from the early age of European colonialism, extending into the 20th century, and Indonesian independence. He is particularly interested in the Japanese occupation of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, the socio-political changes this brought about in society, especially for ordinary people, and the memory of World War II in the region. To Associate Professor Frank Donan, PhD, without further ado, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator. I hope everybody can hear me. So as you can see, I am actually not from Taiwan. I'm originally from Europe. I'm from Belgium. I'm from the Dutch-speaking part called Flanders. And I used to study originally Indonesian studies in Sweden. And then I studied in Gajah Mada University. I have a Magister Humaniora actually. And then I went to the United States for my PhD. So today I'm going to speak about Indonesian heritage and the importance of a sound legal framework. I'm not a lawyer, so I thought I can contribute a little bit more about the social aspects of the connection between law and social aspects of society. Let me try and move my presentation forward here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so basically Indonesia is a proud member of the United Nations, and they have the United Nations heritage list. And on the United Nations UNESCO heritage list, Indonesia has several sites that are considered national heritage. 4 of those sites are actually natural parks. And one is in Sumatra. They're the tropical rainforest heritage of Sumatra. It's actually now considered under threat because of all the forest fires that are taking place quite regularly. But it is one of the treasures that Indonesia has. There are also several cultural treasures. We have several temples here, as you can see on my list. One on Sumatra is the Ombilin coal mining heritage. Also quite well known, more recent colonial heritage. Other ones are quite older. Borobudur and Prambanan are the most famous ones. Borobudur, this is Prambanan, 9th century. And then we have also Borobudur, 7th century. So I'm talking about how law can help to protect this Indonesian cultural heritage, but how law itself is not sufficient. So Indonesian heritage, as we all know, is very diverse and often extremely neglected, often also forgotten. We have the more colonial heritage, but we also have the older heritage. For instance, Sriwijaya, as you know, of course, being in Riau, Sriwijaya has left several remnants and monuments behind, but gradually more and more awareness over this heritage is growing in Indonesia. And that's important because there are also quite a lot of problems that occur. And this is an example here. As you can see, I can't see my own screen very well because I've covered it with Hilangnya Warisan Budaya Indonesia from Tirto ID. So as you can see, some of the naskah or some of the manuscripts were stolen or taken from the museum. Then in 2010, 87 of those artifacts again lost. Some statues lost from the Museum of Jakarta, several artifacts lost. And it goes on like that, right? Those artifacts are often in very bad state. Here's, for instance, an example that I picked up from the internet. Priceless Indonesian heritage. This is one problem that is now the case in Indonesia. Okay, there you go. There's not only that. More recent heritage and quite different is, for instance, here you can see on the 4th of June 2000, there was a ceremony. And the ceremony took place on the west coast of Sumatra, here where you see that little cross here or here, right? And it had to do with this ship, a ship called the Junyo Maru. The Junyo Maru actually sank there. It was sunk during the war. And here's another example. Here had a ceremony. Dutch and Indonesian naval commanders laid a wreath during the 2014 ceremony to commemorate 1,150 soldiers who died in the Battle of Java Sea in 1942. Now, the problem with this picture is the title on top of the picture. As you can see, there's no title now, but now there is, right? You can see Indonesia says not to blame for missing World War II shipwrecks. So what happened actually is a company came in and basically scooped up all the wrecks from the bottom of the sea and basically destroyed them. The reason that these companies want those wrecks is because of the metal. The metal was created before the atomic bomb, and because of that, the metal has no radioactivity in it. And this is very important for medical instruments, where it has to be very precise. And because of that, that metal is now suddenly worth a lot of money. But of course, the problem is that this is very priceless. This is very important heritage. And in this case, it's even a war grave. You can also argue that it's important for Indonesia too. And the reason is very simple. As you can see, this is a picture of the people jumping out of the ship. We are back here next to Sumatra there, the Junyo Maru ship. And here you can read who were on those ships. Junyo Maru, about 4,200 Javanese coolies were put in the front part of the ship before the command bridge. They squatted down and stood there because there was no place to lay down. They had rice and salted fish, and that's what they had before they could get on board. So that ship sank 16th of September 1944 on its way from Jakarta to Padang. Another example is another ship here called the Imabari Maru. That ship in 1944 was sailing from Singapore to Manila, and it had on board, it sank in Brunei Bay, it had on board 26 Yanfu, 308 Romusha. And Romusha, of course, is the word for manual forced laborers, right? Yanfu is a comfort woman or a perempuan paksa, right? And these people were, of course, mostly from Indonesia, other countries too. So therefore, a lot of people who were in those ships who died were all Southeast Asians. Maybe a little bit about the war, very three minutes only. So Japan attacked the colonial powers in Southeast Asia in December 1941. They immediately win big victories. In March 42, the Dutch surrender, the Netherlands Indies surrender. And then, of course, the Americans push back. They gradually push back, and Japan almost immediately loses the war. because Japan is not strong enough to fight against China, the United States, Australia, colonial powers, and British Empire. And on the 15th of August, Japan surrenders, and 2 days later, Indonesia becomes independent. Originally, it's only this red part of Indonesia, but then later, of course, the whole area becomes Indonesian Republic. So what do the Japanese do during that time? Well, basically, they exploit. They exploit natural resources, and they also exploit human resources, right? So there are lots of changes. And all these yellow dots here are all these shipwrecks that sank. Because in order to transport the natural resources, you need ships. Also for the humans, you need ships. So there are many, many historical remnants all over Indonesia. And this, for instance, is in Tarakan, next to Kalimantan, where the Japanese exploited the oil. The oil of Tarakan, one of the most important production centers, and they left many bunkers behind. And those bunkers have now become part of the historical heritage of Indonesia. Another example is this monument here. It's in Banten in the West Java area, the Romusha pada zaman kependudukan Jepang. I don't have to translate it in English, right? And what the Japanese did was they created a railroad line in this area in order to exploit the coal there. The ship that I just showed you, where the Junior Maru, where all these prisoners or all these workers died, was actually on its way to Pakambaru, because there in Pakambaru, as you know, there was this railroad created, the Pakambaru Railroads, and the idea was that the Japanese wanted to make sure that for logistic transport, they could move their troops around. Because the Japanese were losing the war, all the ships of the Japanese were being sunk. So they decided in some areas to create railroads in order to make sure that they could move and defend the area better. An important one, the famous one, is of course in Thailand, but Pakambaru Railroad, Sumatra Railroad is very famous, very famous. About 120,000 Romusha were transported there, and almost all of them died. So it's actually quite forgotten in history, but it is, of course, a very important historical fact, and also very important for Indonesian heritage in the future. Back to the United Nations, of course. Here you also have this is one category of heritage, but we also have several other sites, and Indonesia is trying to promote these. So here you have a whole list of proposed sites to the United Nations, and I will focus only on two. I will take here the historic and maritime landscape of the Banda Islands in Maluku, and also the old town of Jakarta. Maluku is a different case. There, the Dutch come to Banda Islands and they build the fortress of Nassau. Actually, it's already originally it's a Portuguese fortress in 1609. And because the fortress is not strong enough, they build another one right next to it called Belgica, 1611. Yeah, Banda, we all know where it is right there. They also captured the island of Ai. And there they built another fortress called Revenge, because the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish are all fighting for those islands. And why do they want those islands? Because only on those islands you have nutmeg and cloves. Cloves grow over a larger area in the Malukus, but nutmeg only grows there on Banda because it's on an island on a volcanic rim. So these islands are very precious at that time, very valuable. And because of that, the Europeans wanted to have those spices, because the Dutch needed that for their trade. Otherwise, if they didn't have a monopoly, they couldn't make enough money from the trade. As we know, the Dutch were successful, and actually what they do in 1621 is they destroy the Bandanese society. So what they do is they capture the Bandanese, they take them as slaves away to Jakarta, and some of the Bandanese manage to run away. The territory is then taken over by Dutch people from the Dutch VOC company, and they implement plantations there. And then there's also a little later massacre where they kill the English rivals so that the Dutch have total control. This is what happened. Now this is an area that Indonesia is now trying to promote, but not from the point of view of pure colonial heritage, but also to bring in this element of resistance and this element of natural and cultural landscape. And I'll talk about a little bit more later. Another example, so there are many colonial remnants also all over Indonesia. Some of those are in very bad state, but now there is some more protection for them. Jakarta is actually quite a sad story. Only Kota Tua is left. There's really not much left. City Hall is still there, and some other areas. Originally, there were quite a lot of Dutch and other colonial sites that were all constructed. As you can see, the areas that were most valuable had most fortresses. Kota Tua, as you can see, only a few remnants left, and for the rest, not much. Originally, the Dutch created, after they destroyed Jakarta, and they created Batavia in 1619, they created a fortress, and they created this typical canal structure for defense. But as you can see now, even in the Malukus, there's not much left. On Banda, you can see not much left from all the fortresses. Some were restored. Some were restored by the Indonesian government. Like this one was restored in the Suharto era, actually, even, and is now the site that is proposed by Indonesia to become part of UNESCO heritage. This is the Fort Belgica on the hill here. And this is an explanation. I will just skip that. Basically, the reason why Indonesia is promoting the old town of Jakarta in order to become part of the colonial heritage of the United Nations. This is the motivation. You can see here where I got this from, so you can go and look yourself why they promoted Banda Islands, the Spice Islands with the nutmeg, and also the culture of the Bandanese, and the climate and the seascape are very unique, and they can only be found in Indonesia. So therefore, Indonesia is proposing this as a United Nations heritage site, and it's possible that it will work. We will have to see, right? So a lot of the heritage was lost because of natural disasters. Of course, also the climate. Lots of those manuscripts, if you don't protect them well, they will get destroyed. Political turmoil, rebellions, these kinds of things. Economic greed, right? Lots of people steal things. Poor conservation, and also ignorance. People don't realize the value of what they possess until it's too late. There are some laws, but usually the application of these laws fails. There are a lot of smaller and little limited and smaller objects and sites that received not so much attention, and these then are only recognized when it's too late. Now, that's not a problem only for Indonesia. It happens all over the world, but it is important, or it could be useful, to look at other countries and then see what can be done to protect this heritage. So actually, since we are in the Riau annual meeting of law and social sciences, I thought the law actually really matters, because the treasures of Indonesia need both public awareness as well as legal protection. And these forces must work hand in hand. They're needed both for the older history as well as the newer history, both for the natural as well as cultural history. And laws are needed on various fields, right? Both internationally, nationally, as locally, on land as on the sea. Because, and this is important, because this is now a little bit of a funny slide that I have here. What is lost can never be regained. And people think maybe it's not important. Well, look at this. This, for instance, here is a Japanese national site, and it is the Satohama Shell Mound. And this is basically the place where all the people in the Jomon era, about 3,000 years ago, threw all their garbage. They ate the shellfish, and they threw the shell on a heap, and that now becomes a natural site and a historical site. On the other hand, here on the other two pictures are two toilet museums, one in Massachusetts, America, and one in Europe. So things that we would consider now to be not so valuable tend to become very important in the future, and therefore it's it's important to protect what we have right now and still have. Back to Indonesia, of course, already lots of laws were taken and lots of steps were made. Indonesia is part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, protecting the sea. Indonesia also has several laws, both regional as well as national laws, to protect several of these sites, and more of these laws are being enacted. It is very important, therefore, to revitalize history and heritage by building up a social awareness through education, national and regional cultural pride. And it's also important to make tourist and economic opportunities coincide with that, so that the local community has some benefit from those sites, so that it doesn't become a burden to them, but a source of benefit. It can be a source of benefit for cultural pride, local pride, as well as economic pride, economic benefits. And this is very, very important. It's true for both cultural as well as natural resources. So government, law must work together with society and culture in order to achieve that goal. So maybe my conclusion, Indonesia has already made several important steps in many areas, but there are still many examples that show that more protections are necessary. The problem is that often generations will only see the importance of history and heritage when it's too late. So therefore, it's very important for the law to work together with the social sciences and humanities to be a force for good. So I hope I haven't exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
Allow me to read his short CV. He is a research lecturer in the field of intellectual property rights and telematics, Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia. He earned a bachelor's degree in computer from Gunadarma University, a law degree from the Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia, Master of Law from Comparative Law, University of Washington School of Law, and doctorate degree from the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. He is also member of the Masyarakat Telematika Indonesia, or MASTEL, as advisory board for the period 2012 to 2015. Previously, he was expert staff to the Minister of Law, Ministry of Communication and Information. Gimana caranya biar masuk? Oh. Bukan ini kan di Zoom-nya kan?
Very sorry. That is there is a interrupted from hacker from Mexico. Okay, I'm still working on my slide. Yeah. So I would like to remind all of us about our founding fathers, reminding us through 4 paragraph. We should aware with our independence and every condition in the future, worried about the imperialism in the new way. Let's say like that as the one side of the other coin, civilization and reflection of the social engineering, and as well as social construction by technology. What happened now with our situations is we had electronic base, and then there are some ministry regulation regarding the implementation certain application peduli lindungi in order to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And pandemic pushed us to be release our privacy. It looks like that every body, every man, every woman aware that in our cyberspace living, we had already under profiled, and also we have been explored by certain conditions. So I would like to remind all of us that before we go into the content and applications, we should aware with the telecommunication as an infrastructure, because you had already known the purpose. The purpose of our mobile application is the private communication. It's not the public communication. The basic obligation of operator is to warrant the privacy, to give the warranty, to protect the privacy. There is a duties of law 39/1999 on telecommunication. Every operator have a duty to protect the private communication. In Indonesia, we call this as kerahasiaan berita. And now, with this slide, I would like to remind us that the revolution industry 4.0 and society 5.0, it means we are facing a new era of intelligence, because historically, internet is an intelligence network from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. And then the characteristic of the internet is the lack of the security. But on the other hand, from the ethics of information and communication, the privacy is the highest priority. So for the internet, many people now aware with the sovereignty of the nation and state, not the cyber sovereignty, the sovereignty of state nation to their own resources. And what is the interest, what is the condition that from the global legal interest can infringe the sovereignty? The emergency situation, the global crisis management. And on the other hand, to what extent that we know clearly as a user the working properly. They are all based on the signal and code. The first code we found is computer program, and also the cryptography, because where every people in telecommunication will use the signal as the infrastructure. The first infrastructure is signal, and we use code to encrypt the signal to make the transmission become the private communication between us. And then what happened now? The mobile application have different purpose. that every mobile now push us to activate our location, and government push us to implement the certain application in order to prevent. And our president had already declared about the new oil and population administration from the domestic affairs, saying that we have integrated the system. Yes, the government have regulation for the electronic government and one data for interoperability regulation. And then from certain conditions, there are worry from people. People worry too much because some certain media saying there is a breach of the Peduli Lindungi, a certain application. On the other hand, the government saying that there is no breach for the data. And there is some fact that had already delivered by media to us. At least there are 5 facts regarding this application. Yes, might be it's not a breach of the data, but to what extent we can convince of these conditions. But basically, this is mandatory. We do not have right to refuse. And then we have found that some certain fear that there is one feature that is a lack of privacy standard, at least privacy by design and by default. So it makes an opportunity from internal man of the system can abuse the opportunity. One of example is you can ask to the system about the certificate of other people, but the system do not give you question first. Are you authorized for that? And to what extent you have a relationship with the people that you have been asked for the certificate? And to what extent you will use this information? So there is clearly to verify to what extent you can have a right to have authorization to know about anybody. So this is a certain condition that make us some lesson learned. There is two circle that we would like. There is an intersection for that. Privacy versus public interest. There is a constitutional right that every people should secure and comfort with their personal sphere or private life or personal life. Comfort, also convenience. So there is also your rights based on the consumer protection. Every consumer should have secured in their body, their property, their information, and their communication also. And then the first understanding, the first lawer's understanding of the privacy is secure. So the government protect you from any interference from others. And the second one, in the broad definition, it means the government makes you comfort and convenience in social life. So there is nobody can access your personal data without your authorization or without your approval. But for the certain conditions, it's like this. This is common. Every know each other. But the first stage of the communication, you should guarantee to others, do you have legitimate interests to know me, right? And then at least there are two kinds of perspective regarding the privacy. The US perspective is the subjective approach. So it depends on there is legal, reasonable expectation to privacy. Is there any reasonable expectation to privacy for yours? And the other approaches is from European Union perspective, based on the objective approach. To what extent the personal data processed and has been asked to the subject data. So it looks like treat the personal data, it's like a property. So everybody cannot have that personal data unless you have legitimate interest. It is also similar with the common situation in your daily life. If anybody wants to know you, they should guarantee they have legitimate interest to know you, because the communication right is facultative. It's not a mandatory. And then what happened with the transport data flow? Even though privacy is derogable right, it's not absolutely right, absolute right, because there is a public interest, legitimate public interest. In time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation, and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, the state parties to the present covenant may take measures derogating from their obligation under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligation under international law, and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social religion. Basically, the personal data as terminology is not new in Indonesia. Has been started since 1999 in the Article 21, the law number 39 in years 1999. There is article saying that everyone has the right to personal integrity, both spiritual and physical, and therefore cannot be the object of research without his consent. And the elucidation saying that information relating to his personal life and personal data. And also in our value, there is the second value. Manusia harus adil dan beradab. So second values of the Pancasila give us obligation, negative freedom, to respect from other rights, for other human rights. So we cannot interfere any personal life of anybody in Indonesia. And then we have government regulation, 71, 2009, and government regulation 18, 2019. Yeah, 2019, sorry. And then there is certain regulations that basically accommodate from GDPR, European Union GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and also APEC Global Privacy Framework. So it means there is no vacuum. There is no vacuum of law for protecting personal data in Indonesia, even though we do not have special regulation yet, but we have some legal provision distributed to other related laws and protection in Indonesia. And then there is some condition in privacy policy from Peduli Lindungi. But there is an interesting, they ask us to give data, they protect us. They say that they have it with approval, but unfortunately, there is no clause saying to what extent the government and the operator have responsibility if there is something happen with the breach of the contract or breach of the data, the leakage of the data. If this happen, what should they done with and what is the remedies for us? And then to the condition, post-pandemic policy. To certain time, there is obligation to delete the data because you don't have any legitimate interest anymore. And you should guarantee the people they can delete their data. And then there is some information that I would like to highlight in order to make us aware with this certain privacy policy. At least for user control and consent, we can read together, right? Peduli Lindungi cannot retrieve and share data without user approval and consent. Peduli Lindungi will send user a message in Peduli Lindungi application requesting consent. Okay, so after I give personal data, to what extent the system give me progress or report? Is there any agencies, is there any corporate asking me? I don't know. Yeah. Permission requested are only data access permission needed for contract tracing, guaranteed information, and dissemination of statistical data. You can request to withdraw your consent and approval by sending an email. Peduli Lindungi will stop data recording and delete your data from the server after you receive the request email. Look at to the mobile application in your smartphone. Camera, facial recognitions, maybe thermal, and etc. That are we aware is there on, not by us approval. So this is like surveillance and monitoring. From what? From government and also from the global. To what extent they would like to know us? Okay. Okay, I don't want to read all of this because I have limitation times and I have, we should aware that also some principles have been laid by WHO, World Health Organizations, time limitation, testing evaluation, proportionality, data minimization, use restriction, voluntariness, transparency, explainability, privacy, preserving data storage, but there is no localization of data. The first offense that might be happen, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data.
Kenapa?
Is there only availability? No. From the legal perspective, if you're saying the availability, it means you should guarantee there's an unauthentic data. So the unauthentic data should be on their state territory. Security, limited retention, infection reporting, notification, tracking COVID, accuracy, accountability, independent oversight, and civil society and public engagement. So that's why from this, some news, some experts saying that it would be better if there's an audit and there is a clarification, transparency to people, to what extent the system have privacy by design and by default, and to what extent the government will give us liability and responsibility if there is unexpected action would be happen. Ya. Kebocoran data aplikasi Peduli Lindungi perlu diaudit dan perbaikan. I would like to say that I don't give my position as an opponent position. No, I would like to have this more effective and more protect to our national interests. So that's why my conclusion and accommodation. The line to separate privacy protection and public interest at large during the health crisis is blurred. The right to privacy itself is the derogable right that could be limited during the emergencies. However, the derogation should not deviate with other international law emerging from the field of international health law, but still pay attention to your national sovereignty. Accountability, due diligence, and risk assessment are the principles that government should strongly consider when employing technological measures to tackle COVID-19. Therefore, in the present case, the government must have a robust implementation of privacy by design and by default within the technology employed. By time, they should revise if there is a technical error and there is a lack some personal data protection principles. Government and telecom. Now we know telecom license. Telecom as a developer. Telkom have a license as the public switch telephone network. Telkom does not have a license as a mobile operator. Telkom as the electronic system provider at this time. They develop and they give license, exclusive license to the government. Is that commercial or non-commercial? System provider of Peduli Lindungi must revise the application term and condition and privacy policy. Also, the application itself to make it technically accountable in accordance with Article 15 of Electronic Information and Transaction Law, the number 11/2008, which was revised by law number 16 to 2016, if I'm not mistaken, yes, 96 2016. And there is still a compulsory obligation for every system provider, secure, reliable, and responsible. Electronic system provider must be responsible of data collection and cybersecurity on their system. Before they oblige citizens to use their application, first they must ensure they protect privacy rights from unlawful and unnecessary government surveillance. Indonesia would be better to have national encryption policy, not only for national but also regional. ASEAN should have clear national encryption policy and have national electronic authentication framework in order to have trusted identity ecosystem that we could use in cyberspace. In UN CITRAL, now this issue has been explored, electronic identification and authentication services. And it would be better we exchange the national identity number in encrypted format, or we would like to seek the new digital identity, because the NIK structure representing the lowest expectation to privacy, because the syntax of the number had been estimated easily. Previously, we used no more KTP. It was not NIK as a single identity number. Single identity number should be not blatantly be estimated. And then, plus, we would like to have new independent commission, at least independent commissioner for protection personal data for every of us. This is my conclusion and recommendation. I'm hoping so much that I'm not over from more than 30 minutes. Back to the MC. Thank you very much.
Pak Edmond, for your amazing presentation. Now we are moving to question and answer session. To all participants, should you have any question, please use raise hand icon. Again, state or mention your name and your affiliation and to which speaker you address your question to. For this session, we will have for about 20 to 30 minutes. Yeah. Please. Is there any question?
Can I?
Yes,
Mrs.
itu.
Moderator.
Please, I can see you, but please, Pak Rahmat, maybe Pak Rahmat. Yeah.
Iya,
Pak
Pak.
Rahmat,
Yes.
please, yeah.
Okay. Can I ask directly to the speaker? Okay, then I will. First of all, I have to thank to all the presenter. It's very right for me. The first question, I think I like to ask Mr. Franco about your presentation about Indonesian heritage. What do you think about our local awareness of heritage? Because I've done a little research to ask about the announcement of our heritage, especially in Riau. Because I had a conversation with my friend from Ambon, and he asked about how is a meriam in English? Meriam, no? Meriam. I forgot the English terminology of Meriam.
It should be Canon, I think.
Canon.
Canon.
Oh yeah, okay, Canon. Yes, they had Canon there in Ambon, and Canon there represent the level of the class of people there in Ambon. And we talk about the Canon, and he said, "It's from Riau, you know." I feel rather embarrassed because I didn't know then. Then I asked some people, and not many of us here in Riau knows about that. It calls Lela Rentaka. It's canon actually from Riau, but now it's used in Ambon as a symbol of wealthy, symbol of class, and so on. I like your opinion about that. And the second question goes to Prof. Muhammad Rizal. Assalamualaikum, Prof. It's our second time, I think. Prof, you know, watching Indonesian government and Malaysian government, I think it's slightly different. Our government early policy is not. I think it's not taking seriously about the COVID disease, but the present development, I think the government is starting to take it seriously. What about Malaysian government? Is there have a policy that serious from the first early pandemic, or like Indonesian government is developed from not serious to serious right now? And in Indonesia, I think the government use more like power approach, power approach kekuasaan. And what about Malaysian government? And last question for Mr. Edmond. Hello, Mr. Edmond, Dr. Edmond.
Hello. Assalamualaikum.
Salam. Actually, I'm one of your students. Okay, talk about personal protection.
Personal data protection.
Personal data protection. I am actually rather pessimistic about this, since we are Indonesian citizen. What about? I want to know from your perspective about implementation of the regulation from the government, because the regulation seems to be okay, but the implementation, I think it needs some improvement. Thank you very much. Thank you, moderator.
Okay. My name is actually Frank Daunt, but it's okay. Okay. Thank you for your question. It's a really good question, I think.
You may see that government of Indonesia may not similar like Malaysia, but what I know that Indonesia has tried hard. But the difference between Malaysia and Indonesia that Indonesia is a big nation, involved of 300 millions of people populations, whereas Malaysia is only 33 millions. It's only 10% of Indonesian populations. So the reason why I see the government of Indonesia have a little bit need to have do something expedite because involve so many people and covered And if you know, the progress of what Malaysia and Indonesia is doing, yes, no doubt the number of cases increasing, no doubt about that. But there's another tool that been considered is about vaccinations. What I can see, Malaysia and Indonesia has tried to expedite the vaccination process for the populations, the adult populations. So, which I've told you just now, as for Malaysia is concerned, they have a national recovery plan that incorporated one of the indicator is the vaccinations process for the adults. Likewise, Indonesia is doing the similar approach. So, yes, what Prof. Moon mentioned earlier on, basically is globally when we're concerned about COVID-19, is a jungle law is being applied. But at the national level, they try very best and they are within their power to ensure for the good cause for the nations. I think that's about it. Can I share with you, Rahmat?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. Even though we have sample history of privacy concern in our practice, but I'm still optimistic that would be our awareness, because we have a second value in Pancasila saying that manusia harus adil dan beradab, where equal and civilized. This condition only for the emergency crisis. And if I refer to the European Union report in 2020, the documents, the title of the document is Digital Solution to Fight COVID-19 from Council of Europe, October 2020. And the first thing we should highlight to what extent we have a clear definition, clear limitations in the emergency crisis. Is there any special power for government to derogate, to waive the existing laws in order to handle the crisis and handle to this emergency of health? Why? Because if the ministry have decree to push the people implementing the Peduli Lindungi as an application, this means regulations level would be potentially against the human rights law and potentially against the law of EIT, which was revised by law number 19, 2016. Look at the years. So personal data, not new, basically from Indonesian perspective. In 2016, we had already been there, also put our new revised law. But we choose not like the GDPR. Don't forget, GDPR start from the directive, personal data directive protections. So I'm still optimistic that we will aware with these conditions. But the two latest issues, which was discussed in the global cyber law, privacy and cybersecurity. And the success story of the state nation lead in the internet is because they have national proxy. Look at the China. China is not relatively late rather than Indonesia accommodate internet. And China also relatively late ratify the TRIPS, the related aspect of intellectual property. We are the first when this discussion been there and Indonesia access. And look at to the Indonesian now. You don't have national product for ICT yet until now. You spend much time for TikTok, WhatsApp, etc. But look at the China. They cannot be explored by others because they not use Google. They use their own product. We do not have to follow them 100%. Of course, we still open. We are in the as a country between two oceans and between two continents. We are open, but we should aware because our founding fathers give us warning from the first paragraph. Imperialism. We should aware that in the future, this is digital imperialism. Potentially. I cannot be accused without evidence. Of course, I'm saying that I'm aware. I'm what you call worried too much.
Yes.
Because
the
if
development
one
of,
coin,
yeah.
if one coin saying this is a global pandemic had been solved, yeah, had been solved. That is, it means the mainstream you can follow. How about the other coin? The potential, if this is pandemic, to what extent, and then to what extent Indonesia has been survived to protect their personal life of the citizens. This is new oil. To what extent? Because you don't have a clear national and regional policy about the cryptography. Crypto product has been discussed on the Wassenaar arrangement since some years ago from developed countries. And what happened to Indonesian digital resources? You see, in the future, you believe that, let's say, if .id cannot be found in the internet because the super root of the US Internet Corporation.
Kataku, nanti kata Pak Daniel di Sumatra, anu kataku kotor.
Sorry, you are muted. You have been.
Sorry, sir, I can hear your voice.
Oke. Jadi siapa berarti yang kematiin tadi ya? Yang representasi saya kayaknya nggak suka gitu. So I should repeat.
No.
Sorry, I should repeat.
I think it's lack of knowledge, not someone trying to hack you.
I should repeat about my the highest priority. I'm very worried about the new phenomenon that potentially has been classified as imperialism, digital imperialism. Because since the signal transmitted, we do not have power to secure that. The crypto product, do we have national crypto product? Do we have national strategy for this crypto product, crypto policy, ASEAN crypto policy? No. Yeah. And then do we have our special application? No. Digital, it's been determined like a style only. Yeah. You don't think that under handphone now you are become profiled and under surveillance and monitoring. Yes, because this now maybe they have legal interest. But look at the other side of the coin. If this is war, if this is digital war, we have been lose much.
Yes, sir. And we acknowledge from True Bright Mind, the late Stephen Hawkins said that the development of the technology is worried. We should aware about this. And Elon Musk also said that he concerned about the development of the technology is not in line with our ethic or morality, something like that, sir.
So I would remind to all of us in our doa saying that jangan lemah kemauan dan rasa malas dalam menguasai teknologi. Kita ternyata malas dan lemah kemauan dalam menguasai teknologi. So therefore, we are spending too much for digital technology since the beginning. Since the spectrum of frequency, our operator not owned by us, owned by our expatriate. The nation, the international gateway, Indosat. You can know now you have been, so we are aware with this. So our future generation, they have what good stamina and what you call good intention to change the situation in the future. Yeah, now, but we do not have any choice now. Yeah, there is no choice for us. Yeah, just use on and did not object. So I'm hoping so much the government, they can revise the contract and they can develop much better for the personal data protection. So I'm still optimistic that we have a good value and good intention to solve our problem.
Amen.
Thank you, Pak Rahmat.
Thank you.
So Pak Dodi raised his hand and also Bu Maria. MC?
Yes. I'm after Pak Dodi, Pak.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Where is MC now? Indah? Okay.
Okay, thank you for the time. Maybe my question for Mr. Pengdong and Stephen Koss and Muhammad Dizal, maybe. I am a lecturer in Riau University and student of Professor Edmond Makarim. Glad to meet you, Professor.
Nice to meet you.
As you know, many countries in the world had some dilemmas in handling COVID. From your country experience in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, can you explain us how the government should act to solve this problem? Maybe this is my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, should I go first? Hello? Mr. Moderator, Madam Moderator, should I answer?
Moderator.
Okay,
You're
let
allowed,
me
sir.
let me try. So actually, I am living now in Taiwan, right? And Taiwan was actually quite lucky because Taiwan learned lessons from what happened before when they had the SARS outbreak a few years ago. So immediately when they found out that there was this problem in China, they closed their border. So Taiwan managed to close the border and they implemented a quarantine system to make sure that no people could come into the country without quarantine, without testing. And this worked actually really well. So the GDP of Taiwan, I'm a historian, but before I studied history, I also was a business person actually. So before the economy was actually not very heavily affected because we have a very large internal market, 23 million people, and they managed to control that. So that system worked quite well until around May this year for about a year. So we never had online lectures. We never had all these problems. Our kids could go to school. All the things that were described by the first speaker are very serious concerns. But here, this didn't really happen. So in that sense, Taiwan was lucky. Now I'm originally from, and in May there was an outbreak, and then of course things became much worse. So the government took very strict actions, and about in 2 months' time, it's not a miracle cure, but in 2 months' time, by tracing, they've now been able to reduce the number of cases to below 10 a day. But I have to say we are lucky we don't have Delta. So Delta is of course much worse. Right. I used to work in Brunei actually, and Brunei did also quite well. But then Delta virus came in, and it's the same situation as in Malaysia, where the cases explode. The same with New Zealand, the same with Australia. So I think the answer is, if your society can control the hospitalization, and if it can control the cost to the economy, it's of course better to keep your economy open for your children, for your future, for everybody. But it's a high price to pay because so many people will die. I am a little bit pessimistic about the vaccination because I think there will be more and more variants all the time. So in a way, a country with a young population, like for instance, East Timor, very young population, there the cases are quite severe, but not so many people die because most people get better. So we'll have to see. I think Germany has done quite well also to limit the spread of the cases. I think that is more or less my answer. Thank you. I see Stefan has his hand up. Okay.
Well, we should not forget that Taiwan is an island.
Yes, yes.
And we should not forget that Taiwan has, let's say, an interpretation of the civil freedom, which is also differing from Germany when it comes to the data protection. You could use a very well-working app for controlling the contacts, which is here a big hurdle. We cannot do it in that way because the data protection regulation is very strict in this, and people would not accept that they are asked with whom they meet and so on and so on. So this is one question, and this is of course very difficult to control a country in the middle of Europe with a lot of borders to Europe in the surrounding of the European Union, where you cannot just close the borders, because closing the border to France, for example, is a big issue. So here the opinion is that with closing borders, we will not achieve it. The Australians tried that, and New Zealand tries it, and somehow it comes in. But in Taiwan, it was of course more easy to do that, and it is a smaller country. So this is one point. I think when it comes to the vaccinations, I'm not an expert in that, but as the vaccinations are at least preventing strong issues and hospitalization. So if I see the new numbers in Germany, we see that the fourth wave seemed to flatten now. We have today, I think, -1. So it seems to go down, and the hospitalization and the death rates were never as high as in the waves before. But of course it goes up. So if it comes to the question, is it the incidence or is the hospitalization? The incidence seems not to be so important anymore, as long as we don't overstress the hospitals. And so I think these variants will make us really will infect many people, and that cannot be avoided, especially as we don't have the high vaccination rate as we should have. So we have only 62% full vaccinated people, and we have a lot of these people rejecting it. But this is maybe not the problem. I have the impression that we will not overstress our system. So we will go with 2G and 3G now. You was already infected, you are full vaccinated, or you have a PCR test, which is really expensive. And then I think we will be able to manage that. And then we should open. The society is not ready anymore to protect, let's say, 10 to 20%. I say it clear, idiots who are not willing to do measurements for fighting that pandemic. Because the people say, I'm vaccinated, fully vaccinated, I'm complying with everything, I wear all the time the mask. We do not have to do that anymore. We can open the schools now once we have the vaccination, maybe also for the youth, and then I will not comply anymore just because some conspiracy people think they don't have to do that. So this is the social issue, and we are now in front of our new elections. We have this month elections, and in this month, no party will dare to do unpopular things. But after that elections, I think there will be strict rules for entering restaurants, for entering public places, and then we will hopefully open. And then the equilibrium between the business and the protection, the health protection, is in favor, of course, of the freedom of the society, because I'm sure the Constitutional Court will not allow to limit the freedom of the people anymore if just because 20% of the people must be protected because they don't want the vaccination against heavy issues of an infection. So this is what we have, but basically our conditions are totally not comparable. Also not comparable with Singapore. Singapore could put the foreign workers in places where they did not have contact with the society, with the people, with the Singaporeans, and then they infected in these areas. But yeah, they did not let them out. They made a quarantine for these people. We cannot do that. We cannot take foreigners and put them in old military places and not let them out. Yeah, this is totally not possible because we have a free area here. And the data protection, let me see this and to finish for finishing. The data protection, in my personal opinion, and I heard in the car that you talk about technology and the effects of the technology and the digitalization. Yes. The data protection, in my opinion, shows to be too strict. So we have a data protection which is not realistically to enforce it. So if I see Taiwan, we must make a measuring what is more important. Should we control the pandemic, which is a new situation, or should we stick with the old approach of data protection and forbidding anything? The data protection now is from the idea good to protect the idea of the personality, but from the, I mentioned that in my presentation, but from the point of view of the reality in the world, the digitalized world, with no borders, with ubiquity, with Chinese companies selling smartwatches anywhere, and how we control smartwatches when it comes to the data protection. Once we have it in the market, is there. So we can or fulfill our data protection, especially with these apps or with these virtual reality things, and then say we do it, but in fact we cannot because it is not controllable. Or we say we need more pragmatic approaches for the data protection to control it at least a little bit, because a non-realistic law, which cannot be realistically enforced and where the states have no power to enforce it, is not a good law, because it leads to strategies of the citizens to overcome the law and not comply with the law, and then the law is not worth for nothing. And this is not a good law. So in my opinion, we need a liberalization or a new idea of the data protection, also in order to be able to control certain things in a pandemic, of course, after a clear evaluating of what is more important and what is more dangerous, pandemic, or that someone don't want to know that he was in certain restaurant. That is my answer to it.
Yes, Bu Effie. Thank you, Bu Effie. I have a question for Mr. Frank Dunn. Hello, Frank. I've read that the relic of the past can reveal pattern of life, habit, and reveal history. In your opinion, is it true that basically nowadays it is a representation of the past? Because such as the construction like a palace, temples, it show a form of leadership successful at that time. And as it is like today, what is your opinion, Frank? Because I've read some research. He's taught to me that I have a friend. He has a research. They taught to me today is a representative before our what I say nenek moyang, like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Maria, for that question. Let me try to keep my answer brief. It's a really good question, actually, because people always make a construction of history. They see it and during that process of seeing, they have their own ideas and their own vision and their own political values. So history is to a large extent quite influenced by the society today, and that also means that it's it's not the final picture. I think that's the reason also why history can always be rewritten or re-explored and redefined. And the key to having a fuller understanding is to try to see an object or an event, especially with stories and with events, it's more the case, from different sides. So we should always keep exploring and keep getting more and more evidence. But also the objects that we make into beautiful statues or the temples that we see, very often those are, it's not really fake, but those are rebuilt situations, or these are not really the true history. You really do have to dig very deep to find the full picture. But